Welcome. How wonderful to see so many people interested in the deep things of the Spirit, not frightened off by the unknown, what you're going to hear tonight. I'm delighted to see so many people here. And we not only have folks from our church and from the neighborhood, we've got folks from out of town even. How many folks are from another state who came here today? Would you raise your hand? Look at that. Missouri and North Carolina and Detroit, I hear. We've got a friend running up from Vincennes who's going to be late. What this tells us is that people are hungry. Hungry for the meat at the heart of what we call religion. And I hope tonight to share something with you that you can apply in ways that make a difference. These teachings, as they're going to be shared with you tonight, are not found easily. As I told our members this morning, you're going to get my 34 years of journey in 1 hour. It's going to be condensed. Try not to take too many notes. And I want to let you know right off the bat that many of the books out there contain this material. And during our question and answer session, I'll identify the ones that speak specifically to certain areas if you're interested. We also have 2 lists there. Those of you who after this event would like to know more, to find out where we might be going with some of this teaching, leave us an email. Those of you who'd like a book and there are none left, leave your address and we'll send it to you at a price that is not retail because of our appreciation of your being here today. So let's get started. I hope it feeds something for you. I invite you to just open yourselves up and receive. And let's see what Spirit can give you here tonight. Being a spiritual person means becoming a specific kind of person. It means becoming something different than what we were before we became spiritual persons, and something different from the ordinary non-spiritual person. We each have to do what is necessary to become a new person, a transformed person. If this sounds strange, as it does to many mainliners, let me just point out a few scriptures. One of the books carries many more of transformational scriptures. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, how about the famous Ezekiel? I will give you a new heart, a new spirit. Remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Well, how about 2 Corinthians, one of the great ones? So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. How does this happen? How does this happen? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. That's what we're going to feed you tonight. And let me say, because I forgot, after the questions and answers, which are as important as the presentation, as you know, we have a special treat. We have 2 friends who've created a new company called Indulgent Deliveries, who've made some very special desserts to soothe the animal after it has sat here and thought so hard and strained and tried to understand. So be sure to stay afterwards and enjoy the gifts of our friends. They've made a special effort. I hear there's some banana foster cake and that sort of thing. Sometimes spirituality means you have to give the boss a cookie. That's a teaching from one of the people I'm going to introduce you to. Guess who the boss is? About Ephesians, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. Put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Surely, many of us know these words, and yet we aren't given the specific instructions to apply them. And so they just stay lovely words. We are called to become new, called to become holy, called to be transformed by the entire renewal of the mind. We are called to be reborn in spirit. All of this means that we must change. We must give up the self that we are, the ego, the self-will, so that we can become new. But do you know how to forgive your enemies? Or even your friends, and not to mention your family? Do you know what you have to sell to purchase the pearl of great price? Do you know how to be holy? Can you actually turn the other cheek? Give the thief your coat. Love your enemies. Return good for evil. Never worry. Never criticize. Of course we can't. But we're supposed to. That's what this is all about. That's what body of Christ, that's what spiritual community is meant to enable us to learn how to do. If you are seriously pursuing a path of spiritual transformation, you will be engaged in an internal struggle as you strive to become the new person that the application of wisdom teachings creates. Since this rebirth is a spiritual process, there is a beginning point and a verifiable progression in that process. First, we must recognize our current condition. That means being honest with ourselves. Next, we learn to become aware of what goes on inside of us. Most of us take for granted that we know, and how to discern between what is godly and what is not. Next, we learn how to let go or eliminate what is not godly, which changes the nature and condition of our spirit. Finally, by living in such a way, you can be pleasing to God. You can therefore serve God and fulfill your life's purpose. That's what religion is for. This is not an ancient picture. I don't know how well you can see it. These are my friends in France, Orthodox, in Bethany, eastern France. Beautiful, radiant people who have adapted the ancient rituals for the purpose of living out this transformation. As most of you know who are part of this church, I've said it before, religion means to re-link, to reconnect with spirit. We all know how superficial it can be, how meaningless it can be. And yet it is powerful, it is potent, it is a spiritual process that we must undergo. So what is this process? As you see, I'm going to try to speak to your rational mind as much as possible, because that's what functions best for most people. So I'm going to give you a 1, 2, 3 of a spiritual process, recognizing our condition. That's no small thing. Recognize. Sometimes suffering takes us to that place where we have no choice but to recognize our condition. Awakening. Awakening to what else is possible. To become aware of what goes on inside of us. Next in this process, hold on to your seats. Death and purification. Letting go. Let go. Eliminate what is not godly. That takes courage. That takes commitment. And it leads to, finally, rebirth. That strange word so often misused, but truly an expression of what can happen. A rebirth into a person of peace, of joy, of forgiveness, of lightheartedness, all those things that are so hard. Therefore, we are talking about stages of transformation. That is what religion is for, to lead us through a spiritual process of maturing in spirit through stages of transformation. We will discuss specific practices you can use in daily life. You'll learn how to deal with the kinds of obstacles that will inhibit you. In undertaking a life of spiritual awakening, you have to give it attention and efforts. It's not going to happen automatically. They are not automatic. They are very difficult. You have to sacrifice your ego and self-satisfaction. That burns just hearing that, doesn't it? We have to sacrifice something in order to receive something else. And you will have to accept all of these efforts willingly. You will learn to recognize how your self-will interferes with divine inspiration and how you can choose God's will over your own. Then you will have to choose over and over again during your daily life. Choose to be patient and kind-hearted, gentle, forgiving, humble, unselfish, joyful, hopeful, loving, peaceful, faithful, and good to all people. This spiritual work is the same for every human being, leading to purification of heart and mind. It is in doing this personal spiritual work that we apply and benefit from revealed wisdom teachings in a practical way. We all have different levels of goodness inside of us, and while it is not difficult to recognize a selfish or mean-spirited urge from an unselfish, loving one, we usually just don't bother to use discernment. In making no notice of these different urges, we consent to behave automatically. We are driven by the outer circumstances. When we do take note of the nature of our urgings, our thoughts and emotions, we have the opportunity to choose our actions. As aspiring spiritual persons seeking to awaken, and I'll assume that's who you are, we are taught to choose goodness. If we do, then we act from a higher level within ourselves. Higher than what? Higher than the automatic level of self-interest. That kind of choosing requires attention and unselfish actions, discernment and conscience, and the sacrifice of your will. Living in this way is living salvation. Salvation means God-centered living. It does not refer to a continued life in heaven after your bodily death. Salvific living saves us from the meaninglessness of a self-serving existence and the suffering that it creates. So now I'm going to introduce you to some people you've never heard of before, most likely. I'm going to introduce you to perennial wisdom, because down through the ages, in every century, there has always been this lineage of people who knew about this. Not the surface religion, not the obligatory religion, that which was the dynamic, transforming one. So I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Gurdjieff and Mr. Uspensky and Maurice Nicole, who in their own unique genius were able to put into our language, our time, something of the ancient teachings on these matters. And therefore, I'm introducing you to a perennial teaching, timeless and universal, on spiritual transformation. Meet George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. His teachings are at the core of all that is most profound in religions, philosophies, esoteric knowledge. He presents us with practical, uncompromising self-discovery, self-realization, and self-transcendence. Gurdjieff said the following of his ideas: "This teaching is for those who are not satisfied with what they have found in life, and who feel that there must be something else besides success and failure in life, and beyond what they have been taught in school and by their upbringing." The ideas that he brought to the West, to our world, and the system of work on oneself, which came to be known simply as the work, have the power to transform human consciousness and its understanding of reality, your human consciousness. Anyone who begins to practice for a time the efforts of self-observation, and I'll throw in a few other words that are specific technical words of these teachings: the divided attention, inner separation, self-remembering. Under the guidance of someone who has understood and lives these teachings, will discover their radical impact on the human psyche. Why can't this be done on your own? Because from the beginning, there's always a teacher. There's always a spiritual guide. Not for life, but for a time, leading you into deeper knowledge, helping you find the way, focusing on the dark side that hides this from you. And maybe someday you become the spiritual guide. Gurdjieff essentially synthesized ancient esoteric teachings. What do I mean by esoteric? Not secret, not strange, not occult, but inner teachings about the inner life, spiritual life, and the spirituality of early Christianity, in order to make them approachable and applicable to the lives of rational Western individuals, which we are. A seeker will find in this teaching immeasurable treasure, the essence of so many other teachings, both spiritual and psychological, on the inner life. This extraordinary system of thought, which ranges from the most intimate psychological insights to a grandiose cosmology linking the individual with the universe, is a synthesis of practices and teachings known as the Fourth Way. It is named the Fourth Way to differentiate it from the other ways of conscious evolution that have been around from the beginning: the way of the monk, the way of the fakir, that is to say, overcoming your physical self through great effort, the way of the yogi, ancient, at the dawn of time, knowledge from India, and so forth. All these things that many of our generations have been attracted to because they couldn't find anything like that in church. The emotional, the instinctive, the intellectual side of the human being. The fourth way deals with all these dimensions at once, seeking to create a balanced individual whose inner work of transformation occurs in the midst of his or her daily activities. No need for monasteries or ashrams or physical asceticism. Yet the efforts made are as intense and demanding as any of these practices which take place in those settings. The work is entirely inner, invisible, and individual. Then there is the man himself. Gurdjieff was the archetypal master, beaming with extraordinary psychic gifts developed in those schools and monasteries somewhere between the Caucasus and the Himalayas. Brutal, soul-shattering insights for people. Also a man of marvelous humor and ribald behavior in the extreme and breathtakingly penetrating insight. He also had a capacity for love that was matched only by his ability to express rage. He was many things to many people. This old man in war-torn Paris, with followers of the highest intellect of the generation of that time, had his pockets full of candies for children, helped the desperate in the neighborhood, had 50 Russian people in exile with him from the revolution. This powerful master with eyes that pierced to the depths of the soul was also an old man who loved so many people. This mysterious outsider who revealed new horizons that tore down social conventions and cherished beliefs was also closely associated, in spite of his idiosyncrasies, with the Orthodox Church, which was his background. And so he took from the roots of ancient Christianity those psychotherapeutic teachings that none of us know about because they've only been translated in the last 40, 50 years, and brought them to the West. He was forced out of Russia by the revolution, came to Berlin and then Paris, died in 1949, and reframed these teachings like the watch of the heart, so fundamental to ancient Eastern Orthodox Christianity, so foreign to the West. Several important teachers came out of his lineage. Peter Uspensky is the most famous one. He presented the work from a more intellectual perspective, though it still remained very practical. And his book, his masterpiece, is In Search of the Miraculous, one of the best expressions of this manifestation of inner teaching available to us. He originally called it Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, because Gurdjieff had gathered things that no one knew. But I'll share with you now that at the end of his life, he told his many students in London, go back to Mount Athos, go back to the early tradition. That's where you'll find the source. What they created is called the work, because it requires real effort that each of us can make invisibly and internally. We are talking here about an inner psychological work, a work that requires you not merely to know the ideas, but to apply and practice them as well. And to apply them not in general, but on yourselves. This practical application leads to personal change that opens on to a new level of knowledge that some have called knowledge through being. And here are some of the technical terms created in this work to help us put into form the mystery of ourselves. It's a process of self-knowledge which is razor sharp, ideas presented here that have power, genuine psychological and spiritual transformation in the midst of daily life. It is a work tailor-made for those who cannot escape their ordinary obligations and yet need it as desperately as oxygen in order to have meaning and purpose in their lives. This work is about self-change. The subject of the work is you yourself, and you will note that this is one of many connections with the great teachings of humanity. Know thyself is at the core of the wisdom of Socrates. The work offers its own unique, magnificent insights in taking an idea like know thyself and connecting it to our own personal issues so that we understand what the idea really implies. These ideas address the frustrations that people have in trying to better themselves, trying to get in touch with God, trying to break through to something sacred, a higher state of joy or of transcendent goodness, of getting beyond our limitations. Hopefully most of you have had some taste of a higher state of consciousness in your lives, and that is why religion and spirituality are of interest to you, I hope. This work seeks to help us not only understand these experiences, but become more receptive to them, make them more long-lasting, and ultimately learn to live them out in each moment rather than in the occasional accidental encounter. The work begins with this fundamental insight. We are told that before change can happen, we must become more conscious of who we are now. A good portion of this work begins with tearing down the plaster of who we think we are in order to discover who we truly are. All the spiritual teachings tell us that there is extraordinary potential in each human being, but it is often untapped and tragically wasted by the hardships of life or through confusion and unhappiness. The work provides psychological tools that can lift us to that inner place beyond confusion and despair. One of the sayings in the work is that, quote, if we wish to have a different life, we must first realize what kind of life we have now. We are told that human beings are self-evolving beings who through effort and knowledge have a struggle to undertake in order to reach a higher level of themselves. One of the great mysteries behind all of these teachings of world religions is that we are seeds, only seeds, and that we can die as seeds and fail to discover the real potential of our existence. With the right kind of knowledge, the right kind of effort, we have the possibility of becoming something quite different and yet more truly who we are. A person can undergo a definite transformation, a real evolution, if they know and understand what they have to do. Some of you may have heard the term becoming co-creators. Matthew Fox and other such thinkers of our day recognize that we are not meant to participate, that we are meant truly to participate consciously in the development of the universe as well as in the development of ourselves. The work tells us that people often get stuck at a level of being that is equivalent to the maturity of a 7-year-old. That should burn. That explains why a 70-year-old person can have such an immature emotional reaction to things. They may have become important leaders in the world, but something has remained stunted. Knowledge and level of being must increase together. Not just knowledge, knowledge and being and character must increase together to create the metamorphosis, the discovery of a new consciousness that leads us to who we are truly meant to be. Uspensky suggests that psychological systems can be divided into two categories. Systems which study the person as they find him or her, as they imagine him or her to be. These are our modern systems, or systems which study the person not from the point of view of what she or he is, or what she or he seems to be, but from the point of view of what he or she may become. His fundamental assumption is that human beings are not completed persons. Nature develops us only to a point, and it is only by individual efforts that further development proceeds. He writes, evolution of the human being in this case will mean the development of certain inner qualities and features which usually remain undeveloped and cannot develop by themselves. The evolution of human consciousness is a question of personal efforts and is therefore a rare exception among the majority of human beings. To those who would wonder at the seeming unfairness of this assertion, Ouspensky responds that most people simply do not want to awaken. To become a different being, we must want it greatly and over many years. Without the necessary efforts, we will not evolve. Moreover, we must acquire qualities which we believe we already possess, but in fact do not. In the fourth way, this insight is the first step in the direction of inner evolution. We do not know ourselves. Everything happens to us as to puppets, pulled by invisible strings. Stimulus response. Ouspensky believes that if we could perceive this phenomenon, then things would begin to change for us. We human beings are not merely stimulus response machines, but machines which can know that we are machines. Realizing this, we may find ways to cease being simply reactive organisms. Another central idea in the fourth way is that the individual is not one. We have no permanent I or ego. Every thought, feeling, sensation, desire is an I, takes center stage, which believes that it is the whole person. Yet none of these I's are connected, and each depends on the change of external circumstances. To make things worse, there are often impenetrable defenses, what they call buffers, that separate one self from another. Impenetrable defenses between each I, which the work calls buffers, separating these sub-personalities from one another. The alteration of I's is controlled by accidental external influences. There is nothing in us able to control the change of I's, mainly because we do not notice it. Each separate I calls itself I and acts in the name of the whole person. This explains why people so often make decisions and so seldom carry them out. A little self-observation will prove that we usually think, feel, move, and respond to the stimulations acting on us without our being aware of what is happening within us. This self-observation is, in fact, the first practical effort required in the fourth way. The student is to create an observing I, which observes with objectivity his or her inner activity. To develop an objective space within which can see without judging is extremely difficult, but is also the first breakthrough out of our mechanical behavior and the virtual hypnotic trance in which it keeps us. States of consciousness. Ouspensky dismisses the notion that consciousness is equivalent to mind activity. Consciousness is a particular kind of awareness concerning who we are, where we are in the moment, and what we know in the deepest dimension of our being. It never remains the same, but can be made continuous and controllable through special efforts and study. The fourth way points to 4 states of consciousness: sleep, and that's not sleep on a pillow; waking state, self-awareness, and objective consciousness. Most everyone lives only in the first 2 states. The third state, self-consciousness, self-awareness, is one that we believe we possess, even though we are conscious of ourselves only in rare flashes. Such flashes come in exceptional moments, in highly emotional states, in times of danger, or in new and unexpected circumstances. We have no control over their coming and going. This state of consciousness is similar to the Buddhist concept of mindfulness, which Thich Nhat Hanh describes as keeping one's consciousness alive to present reality. However, the Gurdjieff teaching provides more details about our ordinary state, which is described as sleep, the same state referred to by the Christ when he says, "Watch, do not sleep." According to the fourth way, the central obstacle to higher levels of consciousness is a phenomenon known as identification. Ouspensky describes it in this way: in this state, a human being has no separate awareness. He or she is lost in whatever he or she happens to be doing, or feeling, or thinking. Because he is lost, immersed, not present to himself, this condition is known as a state of waking sleep. When we are identified, our attention is directed outward and we lose ourselves. Self-awareness is then a state in which we become aware of ourselves and are no longer hypnotized by the external event before us. There's a higher level still to be reached, which the work calls objective consciousness. In this state, we come into contact with the real world from which we are cut off by the senses. The attainment of higher levels of consciousness is closely related to certain religious practices which are found in all cultures, such as meditation and contemplation. These are difficult paths to tread, because our attention is always being caught by the ceaseless chattering going on in our heads. Yet it is possible to become receptive to a state of pure consciousness without thought, a state in which truth is revealed to us directly without the use of words. Essence and personality. In order to see clearly the roots of our psychological distortions, the fourth way defines 2 aspects of our individual selves: essence and personality. Essence is what a person is born with. Personality is that which is acquired over time. All that is learned both unconsciously through imitation and through acquired likes and dislikes constitutes the outer part of the person, that which is changed by outer circumstances. Though personality is necessary to function in the world, it must not be left to dominate essence, or it will produce artificial persons cut off from their true natures. The quote is from our friends: "This means that with a quick and early growth of personality, growth of essence can practically stop at a very early age. And as a result, we see men and women externally quite grown up, but whose essence remains at the age of 10 or 12. Through a practice known as self-remembering, we can separate ourselves from the pretenses and imitations which have enslaved us since childhood and return to who we actually are. Such a return to our essential nature is accompanied by a sense of liberation unlike any other. To thyself be true. is the first commandment on the way of self-development and attaining of higher consciousness. According to Rodney Collin, one of Ouspensky's primary students, the fundamental abnormality in human beings lies precisely in the divergence between personality and essence. The more nearly we know ourselves for what we are, the more we approach wisdom. The more our imagination about ourselves diverges from what we actually are, the more insane we become. He writes, unless a person first finds themselves, finds their own essential nature and destiny, and begins from them, all his or her efforts and achievements will be built only on the sand of personality, and at the first serious shock, the whole structure will crumble, perhaps destroying them in its fall. Sounds familiar. For Rodney Collin, the soul is the totality of moments of self-awareness during one's life. Yet moments of higher consciousness are very rare and gone as soon as they come. Once again, the reason such self-consciousness is so difficult to attain is that it is dependent on the conscious use of attention. One of the most practical and meticulous study of the ideas of this inner work on oneself is found in Maurice Nicol's masterful psychological commentaries. Here the reader will come upon the nuts and bolts of transformation. Nicole, who worked with Jung and was a highly respected neuroscientist himself before entering these teachings, states somewhere in these 5 volumes of lectures given to his students that as you make progress in the work, quote, what you took as yourself begins to look like a little prison house far away in the valley beneath you. Now, to me, that was a great moment in my life when I came across that. I hope you heard that. Let me repeat it. What you took as yourself begins to look like a little prison house far away in the valley beneath you. This is a vivid expression of the third state of consciousness, or self-remembering, as it is called. These flashes of greater consciousness are the unexpected results of the strenuous efforts made in order not to lose oneself in the rush of outer circumstances, to be cleansed from the acids of negativity, to maintain a heightened awareness grounded in the present. The student is to reach a point where he or she can make the choice not to react automatically to external stimuli. This requires going against the grain, against long-established habits and self-indulgences. The question is as basic as, can you find the willpower to choose not to react angrily to something that makes you angry? Rather than being wasted in such an outburst, the energy accumulated through this effort can be available for a moment of intensified consciousness. Such a moment will flood you with peace, or quiet joy, or a sense of profound liberation. Oddly enough, such rare and precious moments often come in very paradoxical events. When night is darkest, a shaft of light can suddenly break through. Don't you know that experience? Self-remembering combined with the insights of objective self-observation assists in the creation of a balanced individual who is not completely under the sway of his or her inborn nature and acquired habits. It is not possible to experience a vaster sense of reality if we are entirely under the dominance of the intellect to the exclusion of the emotional or the instinctive part of our nature, and vice versa. That's what's meant by balanced. And surely we all know people who are only intellectuals, only emotional, only physical. We need to balance that out to connect with reality. In attempting to make the machine work right, it is necessary to change attitudes and behavior developed over years of wrong functioning. Ouspensky told his students that it is only when we realize that life is taking us nowhere that it begins to have meaning. This observation is not a philosophy, but a pragmatic realization which can fundamentally alter our perception of ourselves and of the world around us. Maurice Nicole gives a hint of these first stages of real change in his commentaries, saying this gradual withdrawal of energy from the customary, easily resentful, and brittle feeling of I is accompanied by a gradual new and broader feeling of I, as if one were living in a larger space. It is like being introduced to a new civilization, to another form of life. He points out that by using the inner camera of self-observation, we begin to open a mind above the level of the sensual mind. Here is where the psychological experiences of the fourth way begin to reveal their numinous and religious character. The same idea is found in the teachings of one Karl Friedrich Graf Durkheim, which is informed by Zen Buddhism, Christian mysticism, and psychotherapy. He writes of the experience of higher awareness in this way, quote, "It is no longer the old I, but a wider, more comprehensive one. We do not lose ourselves in it, but on the contrary, truly find ourselves. A new breathing space, scope, and sphere of action opens up, and we realize only then how confined we had been before, how imprisoned and isolated." Durkheim also gives us a clear description of the first steps of inner development, which are fundamental to all such instructions. Quote, "Practice on ourselves in the physical and spiritual sense is always of two kinds. It involves both the pulling down of everything that stands in the way of our contact with divine being, and the building up of a form which, by remaining accessible to its inner life, preserves this contact and affirms it in every activity in the world." Self-remembering, then, is a process of being lifted out of our ordinary sense of self into a purified, detached space well known to those long practiced in meditation. But in the fourth way, this birth of new awareness can be accomplished while one crosses a street in a busy city or takes out the trash. Nevertheless, despite the practical approach of the work, self-remembering remains as intangible and paradoxical as any spiritual exercise. Reminiscent of the Zen koan, Rodney Collin told his students that we cannot remember ourselves until we forget ourselves. And at the height of his powers of understanding, he united the fourth way with the wisdom of all times and places by saying, to feel beauty, to feel truth, that is self-remembering. Self-remembering is the awareness of the presence of God. The idea that we are not awake but live in a partial dream state from which we can awaken opens onto radically new horizons. The illusions we foster concerning ourselves melt under the light of increased consciousness, and we awaken to new dimensions of reality which set us free. We are then able to relate to the world around us without the usual defenses and masks and confusion which constitute much of human interaction. We become capable of a new kind of compassion, Ultimately, this third state of consciousness, which is our birthright, frees us from the unnecessary agonies of a little ego always struggling for self-importance, and awakens us to immeasurable vistas of new insight and understanding. The world becomes a different place. We become far more than our imaginary selves ever dreamt of. And the potential for happiness, fulfillment, and genuine usefulness to humanity are now tangible realities. This use of attention is similar to the watch of the heart of early Eastern Christian spirituality and the remembrance of God of the Sufi mystics. To be aware of a higher reality while dealing with ordinary reality requires an effort of awareness, detachment, concentration, and insight, which are the result of long practice. These experiences of vaster consciousness have been tasted by everyone in rare moments of our lives and are reminiscent of the wonder years of childhood. But despite the deep emotion or astonishing joy that accompanies them, they are always fleeting, ephemeral, and uncontrollable. The disciplines of the work eventually make the practitioner receptive to longer, more frequent encounters with these regenerating and illuminating events. In proportion as we learn to remember ourselves, our actions acquire a meaning and consistency which is not possible as long as our attention moves only from one fascination to another. If we take seriously the state of awareness called self-remembering, many new possibilities open to us. But it does not take long to realize that there is an enormous resistance in ourselves against mastering this new state. We find that we have to give up all the more psychopathic ways of burning up our attention and energy, which now seem such a necessary part of life. Irritation, indignation, self-pity, all sorts of fears, and all the ways we hypnotize ourselves into satisfaction with things as they are. The premise that we are not awake, but live in a partial dream state, opens entirely new horizons in dealing with our problems and the difficulties of other people. The release of the illusions we foster concerning ourselves frees us to relate to others without the usual defenses and masks which constitute much of human interaction. At their core, the originators of the fourth way, as we know it today, were religious men and women in the true sense of the term. Work on oneself leads to a liberation which can be compared to the enlightenment and divinization of more religious methods. But the writings of the fourth way have generally remained entirely secular, with the notable exception of the works of Maurice Nicoll and Rodney Collin. Left with the exoteric, the surface dimension of the work, the fourth way can be reduced to the development of personal powers and dehumanizing attitudes. To be somewhat liberated from mechanicalness and the illusion of unity can allow a person to manipulate those who are still caught in the tyranny of waking sleep. Every human being moves through their daily life in such a subjective state of mind, so full of illusion and imagination that it is nearly as intensely unreal as the state of literal sleep. This idea seems hard to accept until you notice how you greet your ever-changing circumstances with habitual ways of thinking and responding over and over, creating chaos and suffering and violence in the world. But this man believes, as does every individual, that he's fully conscious, that he acts from his own volition and is perfectly aware of himself and what he's doing. But functioning in this matter, he is like a stimulus response being reacting to life, and he is unaware of his condition. asleep to it. This kind of automatic responding to life is based on habits. We all have habits of thinking about the same things in the same ways, habits of feeling, recurring emotions and emotional states, habits of talking, repeating the same stories, using the same phrases, the same words. We have habitual attitudes and opinions, habits of posture, gestures, facial expressions, tensions, movements, body language, and habitual ways of reacting to life and its events. You were not born with these habits. You acquired them over your lifetime. They are not you. We are thinking about the past and imagining the future. We are worrying and complaining, criticizing, speculating, expressing our opinions on everything that passes through our daily life. We are daydreaming and fantasizing and thinking about what we want and what we don't have. We are dwelling on our dissatisfactions with life, our circumstances, our limitations, other people, and ourselves. And fears plague us. Worry and dread and insecurity, imaginations about physical dangers, anxiety and guilt, thoughts and emotions evoke each other in response to the changing experience in your day that result in a continuous noise in your mind, like having the sand bucket stuck in the same button stuck in a two-way radio. We are emitting noise and are unable to receive. That is why we cannot hear the direction of Holy Spirit, who is always offering you inspiration, waiting for you to open the door, seeking you. If you want to hear, you are going to have to stop making so much noise, meaning internal spiritual hearing and internal psychological noise. In addition, we are swept up in the current of life and its activities. Our attention is being snagged by one thing or another, our emotions changing in response to every event. There is no unity. There is no room for God. Being spiritually asleep means missing the mark. Missing the mark is our condition of sin, not a particular sinful act. It means missing your reason for being alive. Reunion with God. On top of it all, we are unaware of our condition, which is why it can be called a kind of sleep of unawareness. The most instrumental factor in keeping us locked in that condition is that we don't know that we have a choice. We have to recognize that we each live in a fog of self-interest and self-emotions, and we have to learn that we can choose, and how we can choose to live in God's will instead. Then we have to exercise self-control. To do this, we have to work against imagination, lying to ourselves, spiritual laziness, justifying ourselves, pride and vanity, fear, self-importance, rebellion, and in doing so you will become free of them. This is the interior work of metanoia, renewing your mind, turning around. So it is that awareness of your condition that leads you into longing to change it, to become new, to hear Holy Spirit and follow the will of God. Here's an exercise. Try to stop complaining about anything for one day. Once you see how much time you give to complaining alone, you can imagine the kind of liberation of mind you could have if you could also silence impatience, fear, criticizing, objecting, anger, justifying yourself. Getting rid of these ways of thinking, these kinds of thoughts, is possible if you give it your attention. Here's an example. If you feel impatient, simply accept God's timing over your schedule and surrender your impatience. Awakening from the sleep of a carnal life, an externally driven life, does not happen automatically. It requires directed attention and sincere, repeated efforts. You will not make the effort to awaken if you do not know that you are asleep. We have to realize our captivity before it can occur to us to try to escape from it. In your journey on this path, your motive is the cornerstone of your success or failure. Nothing positive can grow from a negative emotion. And acting from fear means acting from self-interest. It is the wrong approach to developing a strong spirit which depends on self-transcendence. If guilt plagues your religious life because the pure and perfect Jesus had to be nailed to the cross and die so that you could be forgiven your inescapable condition of sin, you have misunderstood. In awakening, the first thing we are striving for is awareness. The second is self-mastery, self-control. Without it, nothing can change. The arena is in our psychology, emotions, and thoughts. The flesh-based or carnal nature of the thoughts and emotions must be organized by choosing God's will over your own will. Builds, empowers your spirit, your divine nature. Making that choice is self-mastery. Being aware of your thoughts and your emotions and behaviors comes first. That is why the battlefield is in the mind. Awareness comes first, then you must choose, willingly, intentionally, what you give your attention to, what you spend your time doing, what thoughts you consent to think, what emotions you consent to feel, what actions you consent to do. In this process, you must rely on your conscience to help you discern God's will. To die and be reborn of the Spirit is not a literal instruction. Death to the flesh means an end to the rule of a self-centered life and an end to all that results from living it. This is death of your self-will so that it may be replaced with God's will. What specifically must die are all of the ungodly thoughts and feelings and actions that you have recognized in the process of awakening. This aspect of your spiritual walk is very difficult. The death of your carnal ways doesn't happen automatically or easily. You must have the aim of becoming pleasing to God, of putting yourself in God's will. You must do it on purpose, repeatedly. The change from being self-centered to being God-centered is the result of the spiritual warfare that you must wage internally. It is the critical step of purification necessary to become a fitting vessel for Holy Spirit. In developing the will to follow it, you have to take hold of yourself. In other words, take up your cross and work to become spiritually pure enough to follow me, to accommodate the divine nature of that Spirit. This activity is both ahead of you in chronological time as you develop. It is always above you and available in every moment. This now is the moment when you have to choose whether you go with your ordinary emotions or if you will be obedient and follow what you know to be God's will. Will you permit negative emotions to live in your heart and infect your thoughts and distort your work and words and actions? Or will you choose to set aside what you want and think and feel in deference to godliness? In every moment you have the opportunity to choose. Choosing spiritual life means choosing the death of self-will. You must do this choosing intentionally with the understanding of what you are doing and why. You cannot invoke transformation. You have to work for it. You have to choose it. There are a few ideas that can help you in understanding how you can accomplish this change. Scale and relativity. One method you can use is to bring this scale and relativity into your own perspective. We all love mountains and are continually left breathless when we get a glimpse of them. Its monolithic size reminds us of our insignificance. Its millions of years lifespan reminds us of our tiny amount of time on this planet and our failure to make it meaningful. Our tiny planet in a tiny solar system, in a galaxy of 200 billion solar systems, in a universe of 200 billion galaxies. God created all of this. God is more than it is. Nothing that happens to you or to me or to the whole human race has any effect on the universe. Your tragedies and triumphs mean nothing in the grand scale of things. You can't do anything good enough to earn God's love, or do anything bad enough to earn His condemnation, or anything big enough to be of permanent consequence, because we are completely insignificant. Nevertheless, God so loves you that He came into the life of humanity, suffering the pain of incarnated life and death, and overcoming both to bring you salvation. This is scale. Relativity means discerning what is really important in life with the accompanying awareness of scale. Relativity is a higher perspective that reveals the value of a thing in relation to other things. All of your personal unnecessary suffering is, relatively speaking, a waste of time and energy and attention and possibility, and is of absolutely no significance to the cosmos. It is helpful here to remember that there are two kinds of suffering: necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. Necessary suffering comes to every person at some time in their lives. It includes the loss of love and meaninglessness, deprivation, illness, empathetic suffering for others. Everyone born experiences all of the real suffering that they can bear during their lifetime. So there's never a good reason to create extra suffering for yourself in order to overcome it for God, like the monastic orders do. God doesn't create suffering and doesn't want you to create it. It wastes time and energy and misses the mark of mercy. And then there's another kind of necessary suffering that you must accept if you are seriously trying to live the spiritual life, the Christian life. That real suffering concerns all that is involved in purifying yourself. Giving up your self-will is difficult and painful sometimes, and this you must willingly accept. Unnecessary suffering is generated by self-interest. It feels real because it really hurts, but it can be eliminated by choosing to sacrifice it to God. In fact, you must sacrifice your unnecessary suffering. It also includes a condition we all experience where you're always thinking about yourself, especially worrying about what others are thinking about you. It is very concerned with how you are being perceived and treated, whether you're being shown enough respect or consideration, appreciation, attention. This kind of unnecessary suffering is primarily concerned with whether you're getting what you feel you justly deserve out of any particular person or experience, or even out of life. It makes you suffer shame and embarrassment and fear, insecurity, humiliation, all because satisfied vanity is valued above spiritual integrity. It feels anxious and vulnerable, inadequate, ugly, rejected, stupid, misunderstood, unappreciated. All these well-known feelings. Living in the self-centered stupor of unnecessary suffering is automatic and common to all people. You have to choose to stop thinking about yourself. You have to choose to put aside your self-interest and seek to bless others. This is the inner meaning of greater love has no man. John 15:13. You have to give up your need for approval and power and attention. You have to choose to be quiet and listen until you have the interior silence of being passive to the noise made by your flesh, by your psychology and its responses and requirements, judgments and criticisms. You cannot serve God. Your self-will, what you want, will be making too much noise for you to hear the inspiration of Holy Spirit. Negative emotions constitute most of what we are called to sacrifice. Virtually all negative emotions are forms of unnecessary suffering. Fear and anger especially create so much unnecessary suffering that they must be addressed. Fear is the most prevalent negative emotion that we can experience. It is at the bottom of many other negative emotions. When we are afraid, we can become angry, defensive, aggressive. Fear is an active element in insecurity and impatience, embarrassment, self-pity, dread, anxiety, nervousness, etc. When we demean another because we are insecure about ourselves, quite frankly, quite clearly, fear is the opposite of faith. You can't be full of peace and trust in God's goodwill and full of fears at the same time. All anger carries a degree of violence, and any anger is always only one small step from literal physical violence. Anger is in vengefulness and malice and irritability. In addition, we get angry virtually every time we don't get what we want in every moment. Anger issues from your thwarted self-will. You sacrifice the fruits of the Spirit to it. This gives us an expanded understanding of what violence is. Physically hitting someone is clearly violent, but is hurting them emotionally any less so? If you shout at someone or curse at them or demean, criticize, insult, hate them, you are violent. When you intimidate, coerce, insist, threaten, demand, you are using violent energy to force your will on someone. When you hate, your heart is violent. Anger always lies. It recognizes only what justifies it. So it leaves some things out and rearranges the rest to prove it is justifiable and right. It sees only one narrow angle, so it can't be the whole truth of a thing, which means it is a lie. Everything that comes naturally to us is not healthy or right with God. We are supposed to overcome our human nature, our animal impulses, and its tyranny. Whenever it opposes God's will, being angry puts you outside of God's will, God's nature, His perfect love. This is the sacrifice Christ calls us to, the death of the ego and its self-will and the unnecessary suffering that it generates. A spiritually directed person is relaxed and free, accepting and adaptable, at ease in every situation. They are authentic and sincere and have the peace and freedom that comes from a pure heart. So, tools and practices for spiritual development. Recognize the nature of the sleep of unawareness. These things keep us in a state of sleep, being unaware that we are asleep, being unaware that we can choose to be awake, not choosing it, presuming that we are already fully aware, believing that we are already good, negative emotions and our attachment to them, justifying our negative emotions, automatic habits, constant inner talking, fear of change, spiritual laziness, allowing ourselves to be swept up in the current of our responses to life, all these fearful emotions that we know so well. Therefore, we must discipline our mind to be aware. We must stop and silence negative thoughts and negative emotions. Silence our justifications. Never accept your justifications for your negative emotions. Don't believe fear. Fear opposes faith. Don't consent to anger. Angry emotions have violence in them. Remember why you are choosing to overcome your anger. It is unhealthy physically, mentally, spiritually. Wastes your energy and life force. Never produces goodness. To not allow yourself to be under the dominion of changing circumstances. To choose to act, not just react to life. To become more than only the result of what has been done to you. Practice not criticizing, not objecting, not asserting or expressing your opinions and attitudes about everything. For a moment, stand outside the stream of events and your responses. Sense your true self above them and outside of them. Deep teaching here, friends. Quiet your mind by thinking about what is good and worthy and beautiful. Realize and accept that you alone are responsible for all your actions and your consequences, their consequences in the world. Stop complaining. It is noisy and there's no thy will be done in it. Live the fruits of the Spirit, whether you are satisfied or not. Give up being impatient. It is the vanity of wanting your will now over God's timing. And so this process for spiritual development gives us an aim: loving God, goodness, purity, and servanthood. Observe yourself with scathing honesty. Use discernment to see when you are outside God's will. Practice stop towards negative feelings and emotions. Practice silence towards them one at a time. Choose what you consent to think and feel and do. Do not allow yourself to express negative emotions out loud. How's that for a simple exercise? Release your requirements of life and people and circumstances. Who is willing to do that? Remember that God's nature is one thing, and that is perfect goodness. The aim is to be able to walk through life with a unity of self and remembrance of the significance of being alive, unhampered by circumstances and people in one's own past development. This is the goal of the great sages and saints and teachers. To radiate with a higher goodness is the result of work on oneself. So from small efforts, we reach out for that state of consciousness which makes the difference between a life well lived and one not well lived. I offer you now the opportunity for questions. I sure do. And I will go through that real quick here. This book, which is over there, carries much of this presentation. Many of these lists are in that book right there. This book here offers a primer on that fourth way with a whole expression of the new vocabulary, what it means, how to apply it. This is my book, also tying it into the roots of other teachings. This is just a little extra something about my journey and the walls I ran into and the wonderful things that I discovered. This is a marvelous work that represents much of my wife's teaching in the 90s, interaction between students and teachers on very specific issues that can be very helpful. And this is a brand new work, recently published from a friend in Greece, which shows us how close early Christianity is to this strange set of ideas I've just shared with you, full of citations, a treasure trove of what the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the early centuries, the descendants of the apostles taught. So I recommend this for those who wish to search further and make the connections. This is a question from somebody who's been studying already. Chief feature is one of the terms in this system of thought. And it's quite a fascinating psychological thing. We are taught that all of us have an axis around which we function, whether it's power or fear or vanity. We all have plenty of that, but somehow each of us has that very special thing. And one of the ways that you find out you have it is by being sure that you don't have it. That gives you a good clue that you better take a closer look. And sure enough, with some serious work on oneself, some guided assistance, you will see how everything is impacted by that fundamental distortion, wrong work in our psychology. Generally, you need a teacher, you need a guide, just as in the beginning. From the beginning in Christianity, in all teachings, there was a teacher. And most of us need that extra help because we can't be that honest with ourselves. We can't see ourselves objectively enough. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes your spouse will help you out, but that may not be good for the marriage, Depends if you're on the same page about what you're trying to do. I recommend a teacher. That's why I'm suggesting you put your email down, and those of you who are interested in what you've just witnessed here will find ways through staying connected to share more, talk more, if that resonates with your soul, with what you are looking for. I mentioned Uspensky's statement on there, and it still remains the same. Most people have no interest in awakening, in seeing themselves truly. They are quite happy with being self-satisfied, having a nice meal, and shouting at the next person who gets in their way. They don't see anything wrong with it. It takes that yearning for something else. They call it in the work a magnetic center, being magnetized towards these deeper teachings that causes you to have the motivation to break out of your ego enough to find something new. But most people will not. And I'll tell you right here, right now, quite frankly, the California fantasy that we're all going to be wonderful people someday, I don't buy that at all. One person at a time. Just like here in this room. Hard to say how many folks are going to be interested in really looking at this in relation to their lives, because it's hard. It's brutal self-honesty. It means changing treasured old habits, seeing things differently. If you begin to recognize that negativity and anger which some people cherish, if you begin to taste and see how toxic it is to you and to others, then maybe you'll rise above it. But through every generation and every century, it's always been the very few. I said that those of you who were interested in this material, all three of you, please leave your emails and we will stay in touch. And perhaps, we had something very interesting happen this morning. Those of you who weren't in our second service, we had a gentleman join our church from North Carolina. Now that's breaking a new model, isn't it? That's expanding what it means to be a member of a community. And I think it's very 21st century-ish. And so perhaps that can continue in that way.
Find out.
Understand ourselves.
Yeah, understand ourselves. And
what you had to bring that up, did you? The Enneagram. I didn't even mention it. It did go by in visuals, that's true. How many folks know what the Enneagram is? We have a few. It has become very popular. It's somehow started to become mainstream in the Catholic Church, oddly enough, but it originates in the Gurdjieff work. And it is truly profoundly esoteric, which is one reason I didn't get into it, having to do with the circulation of the energy of the sun in the solar system. But it has become a psychological tool that helps us place ourselves, just like Myers-Briggs. You all know Myers-Briggs, don't you? INFJ and all that. It helps you objectively see, okay, that's the kind of person I am. So instead of having to fight all the time to be that person, you realize that in seeing yourself objectively, you have something to work on. You can detach, you can separate, you can recover something not acquired, but essential about your deeper self, and find that liberation. That's where observing I becomes critical. If you were to try that exercise, to place your attention within on yourself and see yourself behave a certain way, not just be the behavior, you will be beginning this inner work. You will begin to separate from just that functioning that we take for granted. And that is the first state, the first taste of a liberation, of a new perspective, of a humility that opens the door to all sorts of future developments. That's why these ideas have such power. You know, it is because we have faith in something greater that we are willing to work on ourselves. Those who have no faith are quite happy with themselves. The whole process of the Christian legacy, from the beginning, in all the traditions, teaches us metanoia, change of mind, turn around, overcome sin. So we can't start as though we're finished. The faith opens us to the help of Holy Spirit, to the courage it takes to be more than what we thought we were, to expand into what the saints might say, becoming transparent to the divine, the purification of the heart, the purification of those passions, as the ancients called them, pride and envy and vanity, those things that are in us, whether we have faith or not. So the Bible doesn't tell us that you're okay, I'm okay. The Bible tells us, work on yourself. Crucifixion and resurrection. All the parables are about that form of change. The old self, the new self. But many of our current traditions have left that out and make it very easy. His work is finished, ours is beginning. Greater works than these you will do. His work is not just to die. You see, that is one slice of theology called substitutionary theory, which has a lot of issues to think about. What kind of a God needed to horrifically sacrifice a pure man so that we'd be fine? We need to recognize that there's a bigger picture. And the first 1,000 years of Christianity were not about that. That was Catholic, Western thinking of the 11th century. The first 1,000 years were about divinization, deification. God became a human being so human beings could become more like God. So there's a whole universe there, an event horizon to be discovered beyond the one-liners of a certain kind of theology. Christ is the first fruit of many, meaning the template of what we are to become. So we do have, through self-will, great responsibilities to change ourselves that we might be more Christ-like, imitation of Christ. Be perfect as God is perfect. All of these countless teachings that are about transformation. Very interesting you should say that. The ancient teachers would tell you that be angry and sin not actually means take that force and in fact use it on yourself for growth. Use it against that which is sinful within. Don't sin with it on another. Modern psychology has a whole different take on it, and there's no escaping that one. Our culture loves it. I have personal friends, as I've said, who think their negativity is their strength, when actually, I'm sure most of you would recognize that negativity is weakness, that yelling and screaming is not self-control, not self-mastery, not God's will, but to transform that energy into something that gives you the motivation to be better is a whole other ballgame. Well, let me say this to you. You're speaking of the prayer of the heart, of the Jesus prayer. I would suggest to you, quite respectfully, that that is not the only tool they use. If you look at the Philokalia, which is the great sacred book of Eastern Orthodoxy, it is jam-packed with teachings. Take John Climacus, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. There's 30 steps. Or Evagrius, the 8 Passions. There's a tremendous amount of deep knowledge that the monks were learning, the watch of the heart being a very clear, obvious one, that was part of their activity, part of their gnosis, part of their wisdom. So that the fundamental of the Jesus prayer, though foundational, if you will, because it was indeed an invocation of the holy into their lives, uh, was only part of a vast, panoply of spiritual warfare tools that are the legacy of your tradition. These, Theophan the Recluse, check him out. The Path to Salvation. All these magnificent psychotherapeutic teachings that we in the West don't have a clue about. And let me say, I've said this several times, the mystics of the church, Meister Eckhart, Saint Benedict, were all connected to Eastern teachers. So they were a bridge to the East, bringing into the West this kind of teaching. So I would suggest to you that there is probably a whole lot more to find along with the use of the Jesus prayer as a method, as a way of purification. For those of you who don't know what's being referred to, it's the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. With a shorter version, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. It is very powerful, and it's repeated by mouth in the heart until it becomes part of who you are without words. And it's a glorious part of our inheritance that we have lost along the way. Listen, I want to apologize to everyone. I get to see back there that this was a very long presentation, and I want to thank you for your attentiveness. An hour and a half is pretty harsh, but I told you I was going to pack 34 years into a short time. That's what the desserts are for, to make you feel better. Yes. Well, that's absolutely right. There's a time for everything. There's certainly a time to take in knowledge, but to just take in knowledge and not practice and live it out leads nowhere. There are many encyclopedic minds around us who know all sorts of things, but have no depth of being. So you have to trust your own intuition as to, okay, enough already. Maybe one sentence is all I need. The massive intake. If you were to read the 5-6 volumes of Maurice Nicole, you'd have a headache for a year. So it's really a matter of what each of us can individually receive that resonates in the heart and soul, that encourages us to attempt and to discover for ourselves. Gurdjieff said, verify everything for yourself. Try it, see for yourself what will happen. So when you don't feel like reading, don't read. The mind has had enough. Go for a walk. Balance. Emotions, intellect, physics. Another hand right here. We all burn out. And then after we're done burning out, we start again. When I was young and studying all this, I read like a lunatic for years. And then all of a sudden I couldn't read anything. And then one day, just the right book started me up again. So, fear not. The light will come back, the desire, the passion, through some other path, some other way. And sometimes it's your heart, your soul telling you, okay, enough of this, let's go over here now. We've graduated to this kind of activity. And, one of the things I hope to create out of this, if there's enough people, is classes for individuals who are really drawn to this, because it's not for everybody. That's okay. I just happen to have a special passion for this. And for those who want more, you will receive more. So this is step one to see where we go from here. I am very grateful. And again, I know it was demanding and a whole bunch. Those of you who want more, you'll find them in the books. If not, let's go enjoy what our friends have prepared for us and relax and celebrate being together in our common desire to find the way. Thank you very much.